This podcast was recorded at 9 a.m. Jakarta time, 22 February 2021.
Welcome to another edition of Reformasi Dispatch. I'm Jeff Hutton. I'm the regional correspondent for the Straits Times of Singapore.
And I am Kevin O'Rourke, producer of the Reformasi Weekly report.
Kevin, good to have you back. It's great that we're doing this regularly. We used to only talk every couple of months, and now I have the distinct honor of checking in with you. More than once a week, actually, on a regular basis.
Yeah, it's always good to have a chat. And this is even nicer when we have followers listening in. We've got quite a few downloads already. So, people are really bored.
No, I don't know. They're bored. They're hungry for your tuition, as am I. So the way I sort of see this is kind of like my. I have a graduate advanced seminar in Indonesian politics, and you're the tutor.
Right. Yeah. No, I've just been at this for a while. I think I've written more about Indonesia in English than anybody else in terms of quantity, but not quality.
It goes back to 2003, right? You've been putting out the Reformasi Weekly since 2003.
Yeah. 15-page report every week for 18 years now. Yeah.
And you wrote a book called Reformasi.
Yes.
And so you said, I think at one point it was something like 700 issues so far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, you're the man to talk to. This is great. This is a real treat. I thought we would go through a bit of a laundry list of the news and events of the past week. There's Indonesia rallying ASEAN. There's Tommy Soeharto, who has reared his head again, and he's back in the news. Sovereign Wealth Fund. Don't know much about that. Hoping you can fill me in. Also wanted to discuss the changes to the notorious ITE. I hope that's not too glib, but the ITE Law, the Electronic Transactions Law. We're going to have a couple of guests for us to speak with coming up from the NGO Indonesia Criminal Justice Reform outfit there, Adhigama Budiman. He's going to join us. And we've got Amnesty International's Usman Hamid. Interesting that Usman Hamid was one of the student protesters during the Reformasi proper. So he seems quite apt to have on the program. First, Kevin, I know this isn't how you pay the bills generally. Foreign policy is maybe tangential to what you do, but I can't help but think that as a bona fide democracy now in the region, the biggest country in the region, that Indonesia has a special place in ASEAN to start driving the conversation, the regional approach to Myanmar. We were talking before we were recording the pod that it's a bit of a turn of events. It's an authoritarian government under Soeharto. Was sort of a model for the junta in Myanmar. Now that isn't the case. Just what can ASEAN do, and what can Indonesia do to help ASEAN along?
Well, yeah, Indonesia really is special in a lot of ways. It has had a somewhat special relationship with Myanmar for a long time. Indonesia is really clearly the most democratic country in ASEAN, especially in the Duterte era of the Philippines. And therefore it can and should be a source of inspiration for democracy activists in Myanmar. On the other hand, ASEAN has this non-interference principle, and it seems as if Widodo administration figures feel a little bit hamstrung by this quandary, with clearly sympathizing for the nonviolent movement in Myanmar on one hand, but trying to abide by ASEAN's non-interference principle on the other hand.
Yeah, and that's. But I wonder to what extent Myanmar is sort of counting on that. Let's take a look at what the government is hoping to do. But basically, they want to hold the junta to their promise to hold an election and to return to the barracks. I mean, it's not that pushy, really.
Yeah, and it's coming from the foreign minister, Retno Marsudi. It could come from the president, Joko Widodo himself, but so far it hasn't. Just recently, there was a phone call between Marsudi and the new U.S. Secretary of State, Anthony Blinken. So maybe that will prompt some movement in the days ahead. But it's a critical juncture right now as to whether the nonviolent protests and strikes in Myanmar can sustain their momentum, or whether the military will succeed in waiting them out. So they'll push or a nudge here and there, and in whatever way as possible can matter. And in the grand perspective of countries that care about Myanmar and engage with Myanmar, there's not a lot of leverage points really. China is not in a good position to really steer events there. That's not a country that the democracy activists look to. Meanwhile, a lot of the Western countries are worried lest Myanmar fall into the realm of China. But they don't have a lot of levers to pull because their relations are fairly distant. So Indonesia stands out in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, Myanmar now versus Myanmar before 2015 is vastly different. And I'm not an expert in it. There's a generation that has come to get, who is now used to, or rather likes the freedoms that the limited democracy provided. And Indonesia definitely has it in its interest for Myanmar to be stable. I'm thinking of the Rohingya refugees who are continually fleeing the country and into the wider region. But there's also this sort of like this honest broker role that Indonesia can play. And I'm just sort of thinking back in the days of Jokowi's first days as president, when he was really cranking through the executions. And there was this sort of belief, I think, in the higher ups here in Jakarta that they expected some blowback from Western countries. Australia, for example, they would get preachy, and they did, and they had that. But then Brazil was very upset, and it was sort of like the peer country. It was the country that they weren't expecting the criticism from. So I wonder if Indonesia, as sort of the peer country, as that, not China, not the United States, not Japan, but a neighboring country that's already been through it. I wonder if their words would carry more weight. It's an interesting development to watch.
Yeah, ASEAN itself is at stake. ASEAN is already being pulled in so many different directions because of the growing influence of China and the subservience of some countries in the Mekong region towards China, which is debilitating ASEAN. So if Indonesia were to defy the hallowed non-interference principle of ASEAN, will their efforts to help Myanmar, if any, come at the expense of ASEAN's integrity and unity? So it is a quandary.
Yeah. Okay, well, watch this space. Moving on. Tommy Soeharto is back. And there's been a ruling, a court ruling that gives him control of his party that doesn't even have any seats in parliament. Do I have that right?
Right. Yeah. It's the first step in what's probably going to be a prolonged legal battle, but he has won the first step in vying for control over this party that he founded, but then lost to Mukti Purbo Pranjono, who is one of these characters that crops up, and he's been around for a long time now, since the mid-1990s.
Tommy Soeharto does have a past that is there for everyone to read about. Can you just fill us in on what kind of character this guy is for listeners out there who may have blocked out the Soeharto years?
Right. Yeah. Well, what's striking is that both of the figures in this battle, Tommy and Mukti, share a very close common linkage to the practice of assassination, because Tommy Soeharto was convicted and served a prison sentence for commissioning the assassination of a Supreme Court justice in 2001. And that was a justice who allegedly took a bribe from Tommy, but then did not issue the verdict that had been purchased. And so therefore Tommy, in order to uphold a code of ethics, had him assassinated. So
Soeharto era, Soeharto family code of ethics.
And then Tommy became a fugitive for a couple of years, I think, if I recall, and was finally hunted down by a special police team that was headed by a junior officer at that time, who is now the Home Affairs Minister, Tito Carnavien.
Where was he hiding out?
He in one of his apartment buildings, I think.
in an apartment, not in Jakarta.
Among other places, yeah. Yeah, right in Menteng. Yeah, right, a couple blocks away from the home he grew up in Cendana. So then Tommy tried to get into politics after jail with Golkar, but that went poorly. And so he founded his own party in 2016 called Berkarya. And there he was pretty prominent in the agitation against the Jakarta governor, Ahok. And Tommy also had figures who were links between him and Habib Rizek of the Islamic Defenders Front, FPI. And then Partai Berkarya won 2% of the national vote in 2019, which is not bad for Tommy Soeharto. But that was not enough to pass the 4% parliamentary threshold. So they have no seats in parliament, but they do have some significant stakes in some regional assemblies and municipal assemblies around the country. But so what was interesting about Berkarya is that you had Tommy Soeharto as somebody who had served a jail sentence for commissioning an assassination. And then another figure in the party formed in 2016 was Polikarpus. He was in the party leadership. And Polikarpus had also served a jail sentence for perpetrating an assassination of the leading human rights figure in 2004, Munir. And Polikarpus was there because Tommy Soeharto had formed this party in partnership with Mukti Perwan Pranjono, a former Special Forces commander. He had preceded Prabowo Subianto as the Kopassus Special Forces commander in circa 1996, 97. And Mukti initiated the abduction of pro-democracy activists at that time, some of whom have never been found. There's a few that remain missing to this day. And then he handed off the special forces to Prabowo in the early months of 1998, and the abductions continued. And so Mukti was brought in. He joined Gerindra, and then was involved in. Before that, he was involved in the assassination of Munir, allegedly. He was never convicted for that. There was a lot of testimony about his involvement with Polikarpus, but all the witnesses who testified retracted their testimony later, so he won acquittal. But then he went into politics with Gerindra and then tried with another party, and then finally joined Berkarya. So then you have three figures in this party, Tommy, Polikarpus, and Mukti. And then finally, after the election, Mukti tried to take over the party because Tommy wanted it in opposition, but Mukti promised to make it pro-government. And then the government promptly recognized Mukti last year in August as the rightful chair of Partai Berkarya. They recognized the outcome of an extraordinary Congress that he did. But now Tommy has won a administrative court ruling overturning that law minister decree. And so now the government will likely appeal that.
How significant is this party?
It's not significant because none of these figures have any charisma whatsoever. So right. They're never going to do well, but they're dangerous. I mean, so if a threat is a combination of intentions plus capability, their capability is low, but their intentions are very high. So they're worth monitoring.
I thought that Golkar was the Soeharto political vehicle.
Yeah, and that was Tommy's first attempt, but Golkar has splintered multiple times over the years, and Partai Berkarya is just the latest one of those.
So more likely he just remains a sideshow, a footnote. And the faster he gets relegated to history, the better.
Yeah, but another wrinkle here, though, is that it's interesting that numerous opposition parties or would-be opposition parties keep on defecting from the opposition to join the government. And it makes one wonder about what types of machinations are going on behind the scenes, because just recently, the presidential chief of staff, Muldoko, a former military chief, faced accusations from one of the last remaining substantial opposition parties, Party Democrat, that he had worked to carry out a coup d'etat of that party and oust Agus Harimurti Yudhoyono, the son of the former president, as party chair. So, and there's been a few parties over the years, Perindo being one, that was brought out of opposition to support Widodo through seemingly fairly, strong compulsion or even underhanded means.
And so, what's your concern that the governing coalition is prepared to do deals with anyone?
Possibly. There's a pattern of behavior which kind of suggests that there may be a willingness to resort to underhanded means to strengthen the government party alliance, which is just not good for democracy. It's not the way that a healthy democratic system would work.
And completely unnecessary. The governing coalition has something like 70% of the seats, right?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's at a certain point it borders on obsessive compulsive.
Before we move on, is it obsessive compulsive disorder, or is it just his own way of governing that's culturally appropriate for him, and him being Jokowi?
Right. Yeah. Well. Yeah. There is a long ancient political heritage in Indonesia for preferring consensus as a means of reinforcing the legitimacy of the ruler. The problem with these things is you can always find the Javanese person who's an extreme exception to the supposed rule. Amin Rais comes to mind as somebody who is not characteristically Javanese in many ways at all. So, but yeah, that's an element of the diversity that is Indonesia for sure. And so there are political actors who really are not comfortable with the idea of a loyal opposition. Yeah,
the open confrontation is a good way to be sort of left out of the trough. I mean, anywhere, right? But in some places, it just doesn't work that way. Let's move on to sovereign wealth fund. Indonesia has one. There's some backing legislation that's been implementing regulations in the omnibus have come into play. The senior management is put in place. CEO is Vida Wirakusuma. He's formerly of Bank Permada. So when I think sovereign wealth funds, I think of basically a piggy bank for oil money. And up until recently, that was quite something. Norway has one. The Gulf states have one. Malaysia infamously has one MDB. And now Indonesia. Why a sovereign wealth fund? Where is it getting the money? It can't be oil. And what would it be used for?
Right. Yeah. This is the finance minister herself said in the address to the Jakarta Foreign Correspondents Club 2 weeks ago that this is a unique entity. And there's a lot of jokes about it, of course, because it's neither sovereign nor wealthy. It's referred to as the Sovereign Request Fund. I was talking to somebody and I mentioned that in the 1980s, the way that you spelled SWF was AID. So the Sovereign Wealth Fund is really a way of channeling commitments from donor organizations in a new way. And it's arguably unnecessary and arguably a distraction from better priorities. And its prospects are limited, but not negligible. In other words, it is garnering commitments of sizable amounts. There's supposedly $10 billion that have been committed by various bilateral development financing agencies. The thing about that is that a lot of those agencies would have been committing capital anyway. They don't need to have this structure to go through. So it's kind of funny money, and they're just pledges. Very few of them are firm commitments yet. So basically what's going on here is China is in the background here. And then another thing in the background is President Widodo's real push for infrastructure over the past 7 years, which has been largely state-centric, using state-owned enterprises, construction companies. And so their balance sheets are really stretched now. So there's a real preference for maintaining national ownership over infrastructure projects, but there's a lack of ability to attract more financing without surrendering ownership. And this was a solution that policymakers seized upon as a way to garner some capital, which government could still exercise control over, but the capital would be foreign.
The Chinese have a multilateral organization, a lending organization, right? It's to rival the ADB, right? It's a AIIB. Is that
right? Yeah, there's that. Yeah, and they even have a bilateral one as well. Beijing's own development financing entity, and conspicuously, neither of those have made commitments yet. So that's telling because it kind of shows that this SWF, which is it's also known as the Indonesia Investment Authority or the INA, is sort of a workaround to avoid the types of direct ownership of assets by foreigners, and specifically, given the mounting clout of China, the Chinese. So this is considered to be a way to avoid that outcome. But whether it's actually going to work is a big question mark. The client base is really only going to be these bilateral development financing entities. It's going to be very difficult, I think, for the INA to get commitments of private capital from mainstream fund management companies in the private sector, because there's just too much distrust about channeling investments through an entity which is under political control ultimately.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you that. Who controls it?
So another thing in the background, of course, is the Malaysian fund, the 1MBD.
Yeah.
Yeah, 1MDB, sorry. Which was a disaster, of course. And so you would have thought that there would be some extra precautions taken in forming this entity. Sri Mulyani, also at the JFCC, went on and on about how the government did, in fact, take all sorts of precautions in its design of this entity in order to prevent an outcome like the one MDB. But, when you look at the decree that establishes the INA, the government regulation or PP, there's no bilateral or bicameral or inter-branch mechanism for appointing the key figures to either the board of overseers of the INA or the board of directors. So right now, the Widodo administration is acting in good faith, and Sri Mulyani is in the key post of the finance portfolio, and she has impeccable integrity. So therefore, the appointments that have been made for now are good. They're above board. They're all credible professionals with good reputations and no scandals, and they're competent. So they will be effective. But there's no real provision that would prevent a less honorable future potential president from inserting a whole bunch of cronies and then just repeating what happened in Malaysia.
Well, that's right. Yachts for everyone. Well, not for everyone. I guess that's the point. I guess that's the point. There's a point of having a yacht. Not everyone has one. It may not be the biggest sovereign wealth fund, but $100 billion can buy a lot for a few people. So I'm surprised that there isn't more scrutiny over this. And I can't help but think, I don't know, maybe I'm just being a bit bitchy here, but somebody said, hey, let's set up a sovereign wealth fund. That sounds like a big thing to do. It's really splashy. And so it's a shiny object and they just went for it. I don't know. It sounds like it's a lot of form, no function.
It is. No, there's a fad underway. Yeah, it's a bit of a fashion statement nowadays to have a sovereign wealth fund. Yeah. And so now it's possible to have one even when you don't have any of your own sovereign wealth in it. But it's time's going to tell whether this works, because they'll be lucky to get $10 billion. I think the target is to get $20 billion, and at this stage, that seems far fetched.
I've read a Bloomberg piece that said $100 billion.
Yeah, that's just a target. That's aspirational, though. Yeah.
All right. Okay. Yeah. I want a pony. That's aspirational too. I want to just move us right along to ITE, the electronic transaction law, and just I was hoping that you would be able to sort of set the scene before we go into our interview that we recorded yesterday. The ITE is the Electronic Transactions Law. And my understanding is that back in 2008, they wanted to create this statute to stop the spread of hoaxes on the internet. I think there's some provisions there for pornography. But this is of a piece, right, during the SBE era, when there was also the introduction of the pornography law and these other sort of statutes that mean everything and nothing. What was the IT? What was it originally branded as, and what has it morphed into?
Yeah, it reflected a need to address child pornography during the onset of the digital age in Indonesia. And so a lot of the language and structures were adopted directly from international standards for anti-child pornography legislation. But the minister overseeing this in the first Yudhoyono administration was Tufatul Sembiring of PKS, the most hardline Islamic party. And he broadened it to cover not just child pornography, but other types of pornography and immorality and any type of sin. So that's one of numerous articles that are very vague and subject to wild interpretation by authorities, typically police, and often at the regional level. Another pertains to defamation. That's the article that's given rise to the most number of problematic cases. And then another pertains to hate speech. And the penalties are very severe, so it really is a draconian piece of legislation. For all three of these things, it initially provided for automatic imprisonment, regardless of whether the person became a suspect. Later, there was a move to change the statute about defamation and reduce the penalty and therefore prevent the possibility of immediate arrest. But even with that change that happened in a revision in 2016, swift or immediate arrests in a lot of cases still happen. And there's just the stories of injustices are legion.
Yeah, I mean, you could be a local reporter writing about skullduggery someplace and against the mayor or the governor or the bupati, and if local police don't think it's take issue with it, they can go and arrest you and throw you in jail. I mean, just on their own.
Yeah, and that's so that case that you mentioned is very commonplace. There's in total the various cases involving the ITE law, which is really the go-to statute for the authorities lots of times in these types of cases, number more than 100 a year. So in total, there's been almost 700 cases that have resulted in actual incarceration, and many more that were constituted harassment in effect,
right,
or produced legal proceedings. But so the scenario you depicted with a journalist writing something that was offensive to somebody, that's commonplace. But there are cases in which there was quite often it's just the status update on social media is what precipitates charges and jailing. So there was somebody in South Sulawesi around 2011 or 2012, and the province was gearing up for a gubernatorial election, and one of the major, most well-funded candidates was from Golkar, Nurdin Halid. And that's somebody who had already served 2 jail sentences for thievery. And so this person was using the BlackBerry Messenger system, and he made a status update, "Don't vote for Nurdin Halid, the corruptor." And he went to prison for a month before he was finally exonerated. And there were other cases of emails being forwarded. That was earlier, back in 2008. That was the first major case, Prita Maisari. So that gave rise to the Coins for Prita movement to help her out, because she had a fine of 200 million rupiah to pay because she had written an email to just a handful of her friends complaining about malpractice that she did suffer at Omni Hospital in Banten. And that email got forwarded and forwarded again, and then ended up on a group list. And so Omni sued her, and prosecutors for the government sought criminal charges against her. So she had to fight legal battles for 4 years in that case for having complained about a legitimate malpractice that actually happened to her. They mistreated her for dengue fever and made her sicker. And the stories go on and on. Yeah.
Women alleging sexual harassment.
So that's this Baik Nurul in Lombok, was a high school teacher, and her boss, the principal, repeatedly made advances that were unwanted, and she finally complained, and then was suspect in a criminal case for defaming the principal. And she was in the press just the other day saying that she was extremely fortunate because she has followers and friends, and she had support for her case, and that she became a national cause. And a lot of other people don't have that kind of benefit, and they suffer as a result.
You draw a connection between the appointment of the new police chief, Listio, and the introduction or the easing of these sort of morality laws or these stances. I'm thinking last month, the move by the government to ban mandatory religious attire. And when we're talking about that, we're talking about jilbab for girls in public schools for the most part. What's the connection with the new police chief and this the easing up on the morality rules?
Right. So it's two big initiatives just within the space of a little over a month. So there's a few schools of thoughts about what's going on here, but it's important because, like we talked about in the first podcast, the joint decree on mandatory religious dress in public schools is something that really defines Indonesia's character, actually. And that matters for Indonesia's image in the world, not to mention the basic civil rights of the population. And then now there's this move by the president. He called on the police to use moderation in their implementation of the ITE Law. And what was very interesting about this is that the very next day, the newly appointed police chief, the president's former adjutant and his friend from when they were both working in Solo in 2012, Listio Sigit Prabowo, came right out 24 hours later and called on his subordinates to produce a set of detailed guidelines for all police nationwide to use when confronted with cases that involve the ITE law and when applying the ITE law. And then he went on to put forth his own recommended guidelines, and he put forth 4 of them that were very specific and concrete and would be very constructive and helpful. He said, when a case comes up for defamation, don't make an arrest, use mediation instead. And then even when mediation fails, still don't make an arrest. Just stop arresting people. With the exception being only cases that really have genuine potential to cause civil strife for some reason. And then he cited a specific example which pertained to Natalius Pigai, who had been the head of the National Commission on Human Rights, a quasi-government entity. He was from Papua, and he had faced some sectarian hate speech and defamation of his reputation, and that caused a backlash in Papua with really severe demonstrations there at that time, a couple of years ago. And Listio cited that case as an example of when arresting those defaming the Papuan Natalius Pigai would have been appropriate. So that's an unusual stance for a police general to make. And he's not just a police general, he's the chief, and that's a very powerful position. So this all sort of hints at the possibility of there being some fundamental reform in prospect here, and that would be huge because the police are the ground floor of the legal system, basically. And the legal system is such a problem for everybody, for the way of life, for the sense of justice, but for business and the economy, and all investors have to face legal uncertainties and unpredictability. So if there can be some strides made in fixing some of these problems, which are all imminently fixable, just take some resolve, then legal certainty could improve, then the perceptions of country risk decline, the risk premium declines, and interest rates can decline for all businesses, foreign and domestic, and large and small. So it's kind of a mouth-watering prospect here, actually. And meanwhile, if this all carries through, it would just kind of lift the atmosphere of menace that hangs over, social media users, journalists, English language political podcasters, people like that.
For sure. Yeah. So it's all about the podcasters. As we move forward in this analysis, what are some key questions that you have that you think need to be answered, just to know that this actually has teeth? Because right now it's
right.
It's a speech and it's a memo.
It's a mandated memo. No, they haven't even seen the memo yet, and we wouldn't see that memo anyway because that would be an internal. It's literally called a secret telegram. That's the term for the internal circular guidelines that the police use. But basically, cases. So there's a lot of cases that could be dropped. There's a lot of people in prison right now who should not be, who could be granted clemency. And there's some high-profile cases involving the ITE law that are underway currently. One involving alleged hate speech by a musician, Jaring, in Bali. So yeah, I think, and then also all other entities. So will the Attorney General's office abide by these types of principles also, or will those seeking to abuse the ITE law simply shift their focus from going through the police to going through the AGO, which could be possible?
We'll leave it there for now. And when we come back, our chat with Mas Adhigama Budiman of ICJR and Usman Hamid of Amnesty International. And we're back. In a surprise move last week, President Joko Widodo indicated that the country's electronic transaction law, the ITE, was being abused, stifling dissent and legitimate criticism of the powerful. It comes hot on the heels of a ban on mandatory religious attire, like the jilbab, in school. Jokowi's apparent distaste for the ITE law seems to have the close backing of his new police chief, Listio Sigit Prabowo. He favors mediation rather than arrests. Joining us on the pod is Adhigama Budiman of ICJR, that's the Indonesia Criminal Justice Reform, and Usman Hamid of Amnesty International. First question to you, Pak Usman. Really interested in your take on this, and can you give us a sense of the surprise of this move and the significance of it for you?
Thank you, Jeff, for having me. Thank you, Gavin, for having me as well. Well, I think, first of all, it came to everyone as a surprise because for many years, the government has ignored the importance of, revising the law and protecting civic space for public criticisms and public protests. And in recent years, we have seen an increase of the rise of criminalization based on including the penal code and also the cyber law, the ITE law. So I think we welcome the move by President Widodo, although it requires, of course, some additional steps in order to make sure that the law is no longer being used or to silence criticism.
Mas Adhigama, what was the original intention of the ITE back in 2008 when it was enacted?
It's an interesting question. So there are two manuscripts. The early intention is to rule on the electronic transactions, and then the government thinks that we need to also regulate on the cyber crimes. Even though there is no definition of what cyber crimes is. So if you're looking from the manuscript, the Convention on Cyber Crimes, or the Budapest Conventions, as ratified in 2001, it was the model law of the ITE law. It is inside the academic manuscript. But both of these instruments, the ITE law and the conventions on cybercrimes, they regulate strictly on illegal contents. The difference is Budapest Conventions only regulates on child pornography for the illegal contents, but in ITE law it is widened and formulated broadly and implemented carelessly, which is against the principle that law must be written and strict.
Right. Yeah. So, Pa Usman, when you look at the civil rights impacts of the potential ITE law revision, where are the biggest areas of impact potentially? Is it defamation, morality laws, and hate speech, or is it broader than that?
I think primarily the defamation law, the defamatory charges or articles under the ITE law. I think for many years, I mean, since the adoption of the law has been used to criminalize defamatory statements or electronic media communications, and I think it has been wielded with a growing regularity by powerful elites, both in Jakarta context as well as at the provincial and even lower level of political context. And I think it has been used to seek attempts to silence criticisms from political opponents, from journalists, from activists, and also regular citizens. I remember back in 2014, 2015, and 16, I traveled quite a lot to several places, including to Sulawesi, where I have met with a number of people being criminalized for their peaceful and legitimate expression. I visited them in prisons, and I see how the implications of the criminalization has affected their lives, their family, and also their work. So it is important for us now to come up with, a series of effort to revise the law and also to push the government to do action in various fronts. For example, from our point of view, for those who have been imprisoned, for those who were found guilty under the ITE law, the cases can be reviewed, and the president can look for ways in which the president can release them, just like the case of Baik Nuril some years ago, where President Widodo granted amnesty for her, and she was acquitted from politically motivated imprisonment. And the second step, I think, is by making sure that the police and also the prosecutorial office can do the review and drop all the charges in the ongoing cases. Those cases which are under the process of the police, or those cases who are under the prosecutorial office, I think, legally speaking, can still be dropped. And in the police, they can issue SP3, the decision to terminate investigation, or under the prosecutorial office, they have the authority to, for example, to drop the charges for the sake of public interest. So there are some ways in which President Widodo can make use of his power to instruct or to give an instruction, an order to the chief of police and to the Attorney General to take action in line with what he's trying to give us a positive impression that he care about freedom of expression. He care about increasing rise of criminalization by the use of the ITE law. Otherwise, it's just another political gimmicks.
But Adi, in a scenario in which the ITE law were to be, just say, hypothetically struck down, so the entire law was rendered null and void, would there still be problems with other laws and statutes and the criminal code itself? Or is this really the bulk of the problem?
Actually, like most of these problematic provisions, they are already regulated and or can be used with the penal code. Like our current penal code can criminalize the acts that set as and the provisions on illegal contents of ITE law in a stricter way. Like another example, like for the sections 27 subsection 1 on immoral acts, on the penal codes, they cover a broad range of acts that shall be prohibited or criminalized. So ICJR's call are to revoke those duplicates provisions from the penal code. And if there is any illegal content that should be criminalized extensively and strictly, it should be only child pornography.
Right. So, Usman, clearly the law itself is just one part of the equation, and another big part of the equation are the officials who use that law and other statutes. So this really focuses a lot of attention now on the police chief himself, who is new. He just took office a month ago. So do you have an impression or an assessment from the background of General Listio? And are you feeling optimistic about the prospects for changes actually transpiring in practice and potentially even rolling out to other forms of reform of the police in future because of General Listio?
Well, that's a very important question. I think it will be very much depend again on, public pressure. I don't think he will do what we want just by looking at his own good faith, for example. I think when he was serving as a chief of CID, I had no positive impression when he started an investigation on the cases of Novel Baswedan, the senior investigator of Anti-Graft Commission, in which the process was clearly leading towards a miscarriage of justice. Nobody were assured, sure that the two perpetrators from the police were the main perpetrator or the real perpetrator of the attacks against Novel Baswedan. And don't forget then that Novel Baswedan, when he was the head of the trade unions or the workers' union of Anti-Graft Commission, he was very vocal, he was very critical, and he was being criminalized by the police, by his senior as well. So what he did at KPK was partly investigation. Another way that he has been doing when he was the head of the trade unions was to express their opinion or to articulate the interests of the trade unions of Anti-Graft Commission in order to safeguard the independence of and the impartiality of Anti-Graft Commission. So coming back to Listio, I do have some doubt in which he will really be going towards improving civic space or improving police performance in improving the state of free speech or freedom of expression in Indonesia.
But Usman, can you paint a picture of some of the cases you're involved with, the victims of the ITE law? I wonder if we can have an example from you.
Sure. I think one of the most recent examples is the case of, for example, Jering, the musician from Bali. So he was accused for violating the law of ITE under Article 28, paragraph 2. And he was accused to be, insulting what we call golongan, like, a group of people. In this case is medical association. I believe that his expression was peaceful, his expression was legitimate, his expression was not a criminal action. And so he should not be arrested or he should not be detained at the first place. The second case was, I think, the case of Muhammad Asrul. He's a journalist in Makassar. He was accused to be, committing violations of the ITE law. Right after he wrote stories of corruption in Palopo involving the local important figure there. Another case is, I think, Muhammad Sadli is also a journalist and even chief of editor. He was detained by police in Buton, Tengah for the same charges under the ITE law. There are many other cases where we can go into the detail, but in short, I can say that not only regular citizen being reported by another citizen, but what most concerning me is the journalists, activists, or critical citizens were being reported by local official or by government officials, or even getting arrested immediately by the police without being summoned or without due process of law.
Because they're accused of impugning the reputation of someone they're writing about.
Yes.
Pak Usman, have those arrests continued in recent years since the revision of the ITE Law in 2016?
Yes, I think the case that I mentioned, for example, Muhammad Sadri, he was arrested, he was detained last year. It was one of the recent cases, I would say. So although the ITE law, I welcome the revision to reduce the sentence for those articles, but the arrest and detention remains to take place, and including in the case of, I think, insult against President Widodo. If I'm not mistaken, the case of someone in social media, in Instagram. His name was Muhammad Hisbun Payu. He was arrested by a number of police from Central Java Police in his dormitory in Surakarta in Solo. So he was accused for violating the same law, the same articles, and even the amendment of the law of the ITE. He was never being summoned. He was never being, let's say, warned, or he was just being immediately arrested by the local police there for insulting President Widodo. And I have, to my knowledge, I've never seen any report from President Widodo personally, or from anyone from the palace, which means the police can easily take action against you or against any journalist or students, activists, or regular citizen critical to President Widodo without due process of law.
So the police can take it on themselves.
Exactly.
If they think,
this is what,
right.
Yes, this is what they call internal report. So you can't have information on who is reporting you. The police can just easily look, there are a report from internal of our institution, and that you are insulting President Widodo. That's it. That's what you got. That's how cruel, I guess, the legal process has been under this ITE law. The same goes for the cases in Sulawesi, where mayor or governor can easily give a sign to police without necessarily going to the police station and make his own reporting. And then the police will take immediate action in accordance to what the mayor or the governor wants, which is imprisoning or silencing those critical to the governor or to the mayor. I think this to me, this highlighted how powerful this law can be in the hands of the unchecked police and authoritarian leaders at all levels. What I call oligarchizations of the local power has somehow made use of the law very, very vulnerable for reducing of civic space, for public criticisms or public protests.
So, Usman, a lot of these cases you've been describing take place at the regional level, and my sense is that there's a lot of haphazard elements in the process, and typically it involves the police rather than the AGO. My question is then, are the police structured with sufficient discipline so that a change of directives from the national police chief will filter down into these regional police stations and bring about changes there?
Yeah, I hope the national police will change their, for example, what they call surat edaran or telegrams, asking all the police stations to take action against those criticizing the government for handling of COVID, or blocking of government policy on certain issues such as the omnibus law. I think if you remember, in the early months of last year, when the COVID-19 was sweeping into Indonesia's population centers, the government was struggling to contain the virus, the death toll, and even failed to really, impose social distancing. At the same time, they proved to be far more proactive and capable in clamping down on criticisms of its response to the pandemic. The case of Said Didu, for example, he's a former staff of the government. He was threatened with criminal charges after criticizing the administration for prioritizing the economy over public welfare amid the pandemic. And this followed the arrest of a university student activist for a Facebook post that made similar criticisms of Jokowi's policy priorities. And then another one was Rafiu Patra. Rafiu Patra is a young activist. He has a very, 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 very articulate skills in writing, underlining shortcomings of the government's pandemic response. And he was arrested for more than 30 hours. And even during the first few hours of his arrest, nobody knows where he was. And the police rejected to explain that they are the one who are behind the arrest up until I think it's almost more than 24 hours that we know that he was detained by the police. I called the police. I asked the police to release them as well. Amnesty issued press release asking, the police to release him. So that's just to give you an example of cases that has highlighted the national context, in addition to what has been described by me earlier on the local context.
Pak Usman, in addition to potentially reforming the ITE law, what are the kind of initiatives or laws would you hope to see if there is indeed a prospect for further police reform down the road under General Listio?
Well, I do hope that we can revise the umbrella of criminal procedural law, which is the criminal procedural law. Hukum acara pidana. This has been, I think, outdated. It has been under the table and without being touched by both government and the parliament. I think this law, inherited from the Dutch time, provided too much space, too much authority for the police to engage in exercising power to arrest or power to detain or power to investigate anyone involved or allegedly involved in any violation of the law. As long as we don't really revise the law in accordance to the standard, the universal standard of fair trial, for example, I don't think we will be able to improve the state of freedom of expression in Indonesia. Another law which I believe to be important as well is the penal code. 2 years ago, the government and the parliament was trying to reintroduce the new bill for revising or amendment of the penal code. However, many of the articles within the law remains to be draconian. Among of the examples are defamatory articles, restoring insult to president, in which the Constitutional Court has declared unconstitutional some years ago. Also, blasphemy law, and some other similar draconian articles, which was part of the law, which I believe to be dangerous for the future of Indonesian democracy and freedom of expression. So these two laws are very crucial. However, depending on the draft, depending on the contents of the law, that will determine how the police will exercise their power. As long as the law gave too much space for the police, I don't think the police will improve themselves how they deal with due process of law. Or if the penal code remains to be draconian in terms of restoring articles on insult of presidents or preserving the defamatory law, the defamatory charges as a in a criminal law, I don't think it will create some positive implication to the police performance in exercising their power according to due process of law.
Mas Adhigama Budiman of ICJR and Usman Hamid of Amnesty International, thanks so much for joining us. And that's the program. Thanks to Adhigama Budiman of Indonesia Criminal Justice Reform and Usman Hamid of Amnesty International. Our technical guru is Stephen Handolko. Art by Ivan Cristiani. Music by Blue Dot Sessions. For a free trial of Kevin's Reformasi Weekly newsletter, go to reformasi.info. That's REFORMASI.info. And if you like us, please subscribe and rate us. It helps. This podcast is a production of On the Level Media. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.